tell me more about what you want.
Brought an atlas
what
for
do you think you might be doing with it?
Well, I think it's more
family records.
Yeah, I think it's more family records, and
you weren't anticipating eventually launching into a project of some kind.
I hadn't. It wasn't my first thought, but I think it's a good thing to have for both reasons.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I think it is a fascinating topic, and there's a lot of people. I've been asking all my friends if they've heard many stories about their grandparents, and a lot of them say no, that they just don't talk about the time of the war, and I don't know if it's such a difficult thing.
It's a funny thing that there's an inhibition in talking about the war. I think sometimes the fighting arm of the service, the fellow may have had a pretty good show and been in a lot of dangerous situations, but he knows other guys that have been twice that involved, and friends that have been killed, and he got by, and so you begin to think you're not going to boast too much. I don't know what it is. It's the same in the medical corps. I never, even when we're together, we don't reminisce on some funny things.
Mm-hmm.
It's strange. I think it was medically. It was a pretty distressing experience to see these guys come in all shot up. And they were so great. Never heard anyone complain.
Mm-hmm.
And one other question, Suzanne. Do you want sort of this sort of a diary-like form? Just
maybe like the chronological of you know.
So?
Well, how?
The chronological side of it. My
experiences of when you found.
I have to go and tell you what our reactions are. Are you taping this?
Yeah.
And or you can just pick out some highlights that were kind of fun and illustrated the Army life. Or maybe a little of both.
Well, maybe I'll just ask like specific questions too. Like maybe just Mom was saying that Uncle Dan wasn't sent away, and that was because your parents didn't want both. Did everyone go to war?
No, Dad didn't believe in fighting for Britain.
Mm-hmm.
he was against me. Not against me, he just decried the fact that I was doing it. He didn't say don't do it. But I know he several times expressed himself that the damn British organized these wars and we go over and fight them and lose our best people. And, like Trudeau, there's a lot of thinking people in there. But you had to have courage or convictions, because the big thing is to get on the bandwagon, you know. Mm-hmm. British Empire, the whole town full of British people, many of them born in Britain. And it created that feeling all through the...
Like a sort of both countries. Yeah, like, one thing I find interesting is I mentioned to people of my generation, like, would you go and fight a war? And they gawk at me. They're like, there's no way I would go off and risk my life to fight a war. But there must have been a lot of propaganda, and there must have been a lot of, you're not a man if you don't go to war. Like, how did you just feel compelled, like you had to go? There was no question about it?
I think... there was a fairly good component, was reading what was happening in Europe. And, by the time we got in, he'd taken Poland and Czechoslovakia, and he was rolling along, and the forecasts were kind of sad, and I think there was a bit of bona fide loyalty to the country and our freedom. So much so, as a matter of fact, that Americans would come up and join the Canadian Army before the Americans got into the war. And they did not get into the war until Pearl Harbor, as you know. Mm-hmm. And Roosevelt couldn't swing it. But he went to Churchill and said, look, I can't get them to declare war, even on a voluntary basis. But we'll give you all the food and shells, and we'll give you 75 old destroyers that have been sitting around. And so it was there was a bit of that loyalty and companionship. It appealed to the vigorous, adventuresome people, and it sounded like such a tremendous adventure that you might even risk your life a little bit to take advantage of it. I mean, that was, I think, nobody talked that way, but Bruce Charles, Jack Reed, were dearest friends. We all joined up together and went to training thing together. Our wives knew each other in Ottawa while we were training, and we got imbued with a certain amount of desire to do something. It was going to be a hell of an experience.
Is it just, going over to Europe and seeing different places you hadn't, meeting different people? Was the excitement about going over to Europe and seeing different places people hadn't seen before and meeting different people, that was the whole, possibly being a contributor to saving our freedom, like it was almost euphoric?
I think that was there. I don't think anyone that I know was jumping up and down or waving flags or anything. But we all got over there. And so chronologically, after the training thing, I was assigned to Niagara on the Lake, which was a holding training area. And we're waiting to go overseas because the ships were having a bad time just about pretty soon. They looked as if they were going to be supplied from the States. They increased their submarine, and that was a big thing. And they were a convoy started, and they were knocking off 5 or 10 or 12 boats out of one convoy. We had to get that organized and get better protection and so on. But we had, to get back to the chronological thing, I was about 9 months in Niagara on the Lake, and it was really a great fun time. The officers, Ruth knew a lot of the officers' wives, and they put on a big dance to raise money for this and that, and we had parties.
So were people not scared?
Right?
Were people not frightened and fearful, about going overseas at
No,
all?
it's funny. Well, there was that behind it. I mean, when it came time to leave, everybody got a little serious, and a few tears and so on. But while you say things were new, we arrived on. Well, they appointed me to the first field transfusion unit, and they found that they wanted to go out in the field with a truck and 3 men and give transfusions in the field so you could get them back to the units. You see, pretty forward job. It sounded adventuresome. Well, then we went over and we lined up on the dock in Halifax to get on the Queen Elizabeth. And there was a regiment of 900 men, a general hospital of 750, and all big units. And then there was our unit with 3. And we all had to stand as units along the dock, you see. And I was standing in front of my 3 men behind, and it caused quite a stir, because the dock majors were getting ready for embarking, making sure the units were all there, checking our papers and so on. And he'd say, well, I mean, what is this? Well, I said, it's a unit. A unit? What do you mean? Who's you the paymaster? And I said, and the OC? I said, well, he said, where do you get your food? Well, we have to be attached to some of the unit rations and quarters. So he called all the other officers over, and they had a look at the smallest unit in the Canadian, in the British Army.
Yeah.
4 people.
And you were all in charge of the transfusions? That was your...
Well, that was the purpose. We hadn't found out how they were going to work when we got over there. Then the other thing was, you talk about interesting things happening. We were getting aboard the Queen Elizabeth, and you never told these things ahead. And there were 21,000 soldiers getting on board that one ship. And it means they just cleaned out all the what do you call the little bedrooms? The suites and so on. And they'd have, for the privates, they'd have sometimes triple-decker beds. Single suite on the 7 rooms, all officers. And when it got down to the lowly privates, they ran out of beds, and they one half would sleep during the day and the other half at night.
Yeah.
Now the thing was that this is the Germans heard about this and they thought that'd be a coup, 21,000 guys. So they sent a whole mess of we didn't know anything about it, we just got on board.
Where were you heading towards?
Well,
Where
we
was
didn't
you?
know.
You didn't know your destination?
No idea, no. That's the security of war.
Really? Like you could have been going to Japan for all you knew?
Oh no, we knew we were going to somewhere in Europe or Britain or somewhere, probably.
So you didn't know your exact role,
Actually,
and you didn't know where you were
the ship
going?
was run by American sailors, but it was a British ship. So we presumed we were going to Britain somewhere. But where, we had no idea.
Just because they think there might be a leak somewhere?
Nothing, not a word.
Wow.
And this comes up several times. The security was incredible. And they both decided not to go in convoy, to go alone. And it went 45 miles an hour right across the Atlantic. And it would go for about 3 or 4 miles, and suddenly turn 45 degrees. You see the ship would lean over and the dishes would run down the table and so. And then it might be a shorter period, and then it would go longer before the next turn. But it zigzagged across the Atlantic. And all of a sudden we found that it was getting cold outside. And you go out on deck in the day, and it was damn chilly. And some of the older sailors said, there's no question in my mind, we're not going on the route to Britain. We're north somewhere. And when we got safely landed in England, we found we'd been up around Iceland because they discovered with the radar, which is a very new thing, that these submarines were all lined up and trying to get this boat. Just it was one of the first. Anyway, we landed up in Scotland. A famous shipbuilding place, I forget the name of it. So we were told to get off.
Sorry, just to interject, when was this? Like what year?
Well, I joined in 41. And we spent about 9 months, 8 or 9 months at Niagara. And in 1942 I was called up and we went down on a troop train. And went down
was it the summer or winter? Or?
It was winter. I think it was late fall.
Late fall.
Yes, it was late fall. And we got on, the whole 21,000 were lined up on decks and docks and so on. And trains came in, and the busy guys running around and calling out the names of units and so on. And as soon as you get our name, they said, get in there. And so we get in there. And there you were. And the train pulled off, and you weren't even sure we were in Scotland. We didn't learn that till later.
Really?
And we didn't know where we were going in the train. And,
were you divided up? Like, did you have friends who'd gone with you and you were going in different directions?
Just my unit.
But were your units...
A lance corporal, 2 privates, and myself.
Did you know them before, or did you just meet them through training?
I picked them before we left, yes. I knew them.
But what about all the people I hear about, like Bill Mustard or any of your...
I mean, you just sat in goddamn compartment and he didn't move. I mean, they said just stay there.
Were you starting to get nervous at this point?
Sorry?
Were you getting nervous or frightened at this point? Like,
No,
did
no, it was all just interesting as hell. Not to know
Yeah.
where you're going.
I should find a map while you say this, so...
Oh, it's a famous shipbuilding firm.
Find something of Europe.
We had no firepower on that boat. The QE was quite without any guns, as far as I know.
Mm-hmm. So the general.
I wonder if I can see the name of that one.
Yeah, that one's not that detailed. It just says Glasgow,
Glasgow,
Edinburgh.
No, it's up. It's a famous ship. Yes, it's on the. That's
The west
coast, and quite far north.
Yeah. And then you got on trains.
Got on the train and we went down and down. I don't know how long we were there. No facilities and no food, I don't think, because we had a little box of rations that we could eat.
Mm-hmm.
Emergency ration. We went. It wasn't far from London. Aldershot was the oldest army camp in Britain, and old stone buildings and so on.
Mm-hmm.
We got off there, and somebody seemed to have it figured out where we were going.
Now, was London, was it very devastated at the time? Like, was there...
Well, I was not near London as yet. You see, we got dumped off in Aldershot.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know how long I was there, a few months. And took some training, and I don't know whether I went into London from there. I probably did, if it was possible. And then I was picked, I was called in and I was told that the 6th Casualty Clearing Station wanted me to join them as an officer, and I'd give up my job as the OC of, no, I was to join the Casualty Clearing Station as a transfusion officer with the prospect of becoming a surgeon, you know, and turning over the transfusion job to somebody else.
Okay.
This was at McGill unit, and the guy who eventually Doug, mostly Westerners at McGill, Doug Cameron eventually became professor, and Ben Crosby, who was the senior surgeon out west in Regina. Wonderful, wonderful group of people. And, so I joined them in training, and what they did in those days, they would take a unit and they'd send it to somebody's mansion. I was in Sir Malcolm Campbell's residence. Do you remember the man who first broke the 100-mile? He was a speed king, both on water and land. Very famous, very wealthy guy. And this is south of London, in Dorking. And all the Canadian soldiers are fleet outfit in the same area in London.
Mm-hmm.
It was in Surrey, and Dorking, Box Hill, Wilfred. Those cities, towns. The central, all our units were usually on the canvas, unless they were relegated to a house. Since we were going to be active as a casualty training station, there was a big house that the officers lived in, another that the nursing students used, which we used as a hospital operating room, admission, first aid, and that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And they had, and that was an interesting life. We did a bit of surgery, not a great deal, but they didn't want telephone conversation between units. So if our unit wanted to contact a regiment, it was 30 miles away, they were not allowed to get the map references to where they were. You had to phone. No. You got the map reference where they were, but you're not allowed to phone them for fear the wire would be tapped or something. So they had, the Canadian Army had motorcycles screaming all over the place. And Lord Haw, the PR guy from Hitler in Germany, he used to pick some fantastic bits of news, which no one knows how he got a hold of. But he gave the statistics for the number of motorcyclists that had been injured and the number killed in the Canadian Army on this business of taking messages. And he said, we're quite content if we leave the Canadian Army there long enough, they'll kill themselves off.
Yeah.
So it was a strange, everything was very
So
strange.
did you just have your ear like glued to the radio trying to figure out what was going on?
No, because there's nothing coming over the radio.
Nothing.
There'd be a little bit in the newspapers, and there'd be enough to keep everybody's spirits up. And the bombing had just petered down. It was petering down, and they decided that they were losing too many bombers because the British fighter squadrons, along with Canadian bush pilots and so on, were joining up and producing a fantastic fighter squadrons that took on these bombers and would fly up and shoot them down. They were losing bombers without number. And finally, Hitler called that off and sent these buzz bombs and V2s that weren't manned. They just flew along and then suddenly died. And it was about that time he began to wonder what he was going to do. He began to think that the only way to get to the Britain would be to starve them out. I don't know. He was going to invade first, and that was too tough. And he was going to smash the morale by bombing cities and having women and children beg to be released. And he thought that they would just collapse, and it didn't. So I don't know what, I think his next move was perhaps to try and stop these shipments coming over from America. Anyway, that led up to a long period in England. Where we,
Did you write letters to Grammy?
Oh,
Is that
no.
how you kept in touch?
They had one-page letters, and they were all you just wrote them open and sent them over. I don't know how they were sent over, but everything was censored anyway.
Just so they
The
wouldn't,
padre of the unit had to read every letter.
just in case you leaked where you, like, specific details about what you were doing, and it...
Oh, there might be. You see, the business of what do you call the information gathering group? What's the name?
Who do censuses, or...
These people they rely on thousands of little taps here and there. And they just get a tiny little bit of evidence from each one, but they put it all together, like compute it, and say, gee, everybody seems to be centering around here. So they didn't allow anybody to say anything. And we were not allowed to tell our wives where we were.
Really?
Yeah.
So you couldn't even say that you were in Britain?
Well, I think we told her we were in Britain. Yeah.
But you couldn't say whereabouts or what you were doing, or...
No, I couldn't say anything.
So it was more like, I miss you, I love you, and all that, but nothing...
And I saw Bill Mustard yesterday, and he did a sort of thing, and all that sort of
Yeah. Well, Bill Mustard was with you?
Well, he was with another unit.
Did you see him when you were in
Oh,
Britain?
yes. We spent the first Christmas together.
Yeah.
And a very formal Christmas dinner in Aldershot with all the generals and brigadier generals and everybody. And he put on quite a show.
Yeah.
He had too much to drink. And he had a great big poached salmon in the center of the big dining room. And he got horsing around and pretending he was casting for the salmon, you see. He attracted all the British officers. They'd never seen anybody do this in front of a general.
Yeah.
And he got a whole mass of young guys urging him on. Of course, he responded. So the equerry of one of the generals came over to me and said, "Excuse me, sir, are you Captain Bigelow of the 6th CCS?" And I said, "Yes." He said, is that gentleman over there, is he your guest?" And he said, "Yes. Beg your pardon, sir, General so-and-so. I'd like you to remove him from the dining room."
Oh, really?
So we went back to my room, and Ruth had sent a bottle of rum and a loaf of bread, which was the typical thing. You snuggle it right inside the loaf of bread, you see.
Oh, really?
And it protected the bottle, and it looked like a loaf of bread.
Yeah. That's a good idea.
So all those things went on, and finally, we were, I think the Americans and Canadians, there must have been 1.5 million soldiers in Britain. Everything was just solid. You go to London, it's just, the guys, the Poles, Hungarians, everything you can think of.
Mm-hmm.
The Free French, Americans, hotels crowded, prostitutes doing a fantastic business.
Mm-hmm.
And it was really wild. And then come evening, and there wasn't a light, not a signboard, no indication whether you're looking at a boarding house or a Piccadilly hotel or anything. And it was a little awesome for me at first. First night I took up along Piccadilly, and I bumped into a telephone pole, and I just realized this wasn't killing this stuff. And they had people going around, all during the war, during that part of the war, and there was a detachment of people who went up and down the streets, and if there was a tiny little wedge of light coming from the third floor bedroom or something, they were...
So just so the bombers wouldn't see the lights?
They didn't want anybody to see the light, so the bombers could identify exactly where they were.
Yeah.
They were looking for populated areas, you see, to destroy the morale. And you'd be called down and bawled out for having a little strip of light there. It was quite an interesting period.
Mm-hmm.
And I had one funny experience. The first time I was in London, I was short of money. And I knew there was a Canadian club, and they used to serve lunches, and they had a lounge and so on. And so I went to the hotel. To them, I asked if they'd cash it. I said, "Look, I'm an officer. If I cash a check, it's no good. I'm cashing." I mean, all these soldiers from all over the world wandering around, you sure as hell wouldn't cash a personal check.
Yeah.
So I looked around and I said, "Now, of all these guys wandering around the lobby here, I want to get somebody. There's an Air Force RAF squadron leader. Well, that's like a major. Now, if he gets any higher, he gets out of touch. He doesn't know the ropes. Gets a little lower, maybe he's not in on something. I'll speak to him." So I went over. I was a captain, and I had to address him as sir. I said, "Sir, I wonder if you could help me." I'll be glad to." And I looked at him, RAF, and I said, I want to cash a check. I don't know if you know about the Canadian club here, which I thought might be available, or where anyone can cash a check. He says, "I don't know." He says, "You've got a real tough proposition on your hand there, trying to cash a check this hour of the night." And so I looked at him and I said, "Well, maybe I'm talking to the wrong fellow, because there's a lot of Americans used to come up and join."
So this is the American had joined the war at this. But had they joined the war at this point?
Sorry?
Had the Americans joined the war at this point?
No, they hadn't.
Okay.
So, but there were some coming up and joining, you see.
Oh, okay. Oh, I see.
Personally.
Yeah,
They come up to Canada going somehow.
yeah.
So I said, well, maybe I'm talking to the wrong guy. I guess you're an American. No, he says, I've never left this country my whole life, but he says, I've been attached to American squadron for 6 months.
Really? So he picked up the
He had the
accent.
thickest southern accent.
Yeah. Well, I used to do that as a kid when I'd go over to the continent. I'd come back with an Irish accent.
Yeah.
Because you do. It starts growing on you when you're surrounded.
Well, the action started. There was a Spartan scheme, and they tried to duplicate everything that's going to happen when we land in Normandy. And they divided the two armies into the red and white, and the battle plans, and no one knew what the other guy was going to do. And they were testing with the generals to see how smart they were, and to make sure that there was good transportation. And we were with our truck and our refrigerator, and 3 guys, and myself, the driver. And, so we got in this, and you have to follow maps. But if you come to a little town, you don't know where the hell the town is on the map. You don't know which one it is, and you stop and you say, "Hi, lady, I'm a Canadian from Canada, and we're on a scheme here, and could you tell me the name of this town, please?" She'd just look you in the eye and she'd say, "Sorry." Couldn't get it from anybody.
Why? Because they didn't know?
Well, because they thought if Hitler invaded, he wouldn't be silly and send a bunch of German troops over. What he probably would do would get enough British uniforms.
Yeah, so they didn't
and
trust
look at-
anybody.
And the first inroads would be a bunch of Britishers who were probably more British than the British. And so they were not allowed to tell them anything. And so we sat there, so no one knew when we were going to be
So
caught.
this is when you're coming over to mainland?
Well, we're going to... here's where we're going to
So
land.
you were in northern France.
That's northern France. Do you see
I think there's a bigger one of France. Where is it? There. Here's France.
Do you see Cherbourg? Cherbourg.
Mm-hmm.
And Cherbourg. The Normandy was...
Is the region, is it not, in northern?
oh, yeah, it's the whole area here, but I mean, the Normandy beach stretched from Cherbourg Harbor, which was American.
Mm-hmm.
Where's Caen? Is it Caen there?
Yep, it's right there.
Oh, you see, well, it was a small beachhead because we were north of Caen when we landed. We're only about 5 or 6 miles from Caen, about the same distance from. So we weren't far from the beach. We could drive in a couple of minutes. And but to get there, we had to. Have you got an English one to show the Thames?
We'll probably be nearby. Well, here's Britain here.
Oh, good. Now, all of a sudden one night we were waking up and told to get packed up. We were leaving. And you had to pack everything up. We were in Dorking, south of London. There. And they had trucks, and we piled in trucks with our gear and went to the Thames River. And we found great big areas all fenced in and so on. We were stuck for a day or so, not knowing what was going on. And then we had a boat, and we were put on board a boat. And it was pretty meager stuff. The senior officers got up to the forepart of the boat. This is just a small merchant navy, you know. Mm-hmm. And the rest of us were down below decks on hammocks.
I've never slept in a hammock before. I've been in one, it was kind of stuffy in there, but we're not allowed to go out, and of course not allowed to smoke, and no flashlights and so on. But the thing was that to get from here, where
There's Ken.
to there, we had to go by Calais and some of that. Is that Calais there?
That's Calais right there. Yeah.
Right there.
Mhm.
And they had a whole mass of artillery that easily crossed that isthmus. And if they were aware that any boats were going, they just smattered them. And they were knocking out a fair number, so that they were all going at night. But even then, they had enough information from planes flying over, telling them there's a flotilla just gone out of the harbor, you know. So they'd even shoot. I suppose they'd even shoot blindly. I don't know. I don't know if they had any radar at that time. That was the first danger we were exposed to.
Mhm.
And we were just in the hold of that ship, and if you were hit, there were no life jackets or anything. As far as I recall, they just figured that we could never get life jackets on a whole gang of guys and get them out. So we just took the chance. And then we landed, and we got out on the channel. And this was D-Day plus 10 days or 12 days. And they was onto the beach from either side.
So this is when Britain joined the war, D-Day. This is right around that time?
This is 44 on the D-Day.
Oh, so this is 44 by the time that you're coming to mainland Europe.
43 or 44? 43 probably. The D-Day. We should know D-Day.
Yeah, I know.
June the 5th, but I'm not sure of the year.
I think it's 43.
Yeah, June the 5th, 43. And they still were suffering from shells and also planes coming over. But that settled down a bit,
Mm-hmm.
and the British got a little more air mastery. And our unit was our first unit to I think there was one beach that was calm. A very narrow beachhead. I think I forget the first one. One of the very central ones was Juno. It was practically all Canadian, and these are British. And I think this was more British, and then the rest of these were American. But we were closest to calm, and all casualties until the time we arrived were gathered together and shipped over, either in boat or plane.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, the same boat that brought the troops over, they landed. And what happened with the troop boat was that it anchored about half a mile or a quarter mile offshore. And one of these landing craft had come on, where the whole end falls down.
Mm-hmm.
And we'd have to go down rope ladders and get on this. And then they shoot right for the shore. And when it hit the shore, I don't think we got wet, maybe.
Yeah, they had those in the movie.
If they were
The landing
heavily
crafts.
loaded, and during the war, I think very often they had to jump in, or depending on the nature of the beach. And we didn't get very wet,
Mm-hmm.
because from some of the movies and so on, someone had to jump in deeper water, and someone never came up in that.
Mm-hmm.
So we got on board on the beach, our unit.
What do you mean some never came up again? It was just too deep and some drowned? Is that what you were saying? Some never came up again?
Oh, and during the initial fighting, when they were landing first.
Mm-hmm.
That was a bad show, because they had batteries
machine guns all the way along that coast. There was only obvious places to go. And what was supposed to happen was the naval ship was supposed to all line up and just bomb the hell out of the cliffs, just indiscriminately. And before we got there, so they didn't care where the shells were. And the Free French had all been told to get away as best you could. That never happened. So they just shooting these guys just like in a...
Well, they were shooting the French civilians?
Just like... No, they were shooting... No, so we're going back to D-Day.
This is you coming in to the coast of Normandy.
We didn't come in on D-Day. But
No.
I'm saying when we did come in on D-Day, it was a whole different ball of wax. I mean, they were being mowed down, literally. And
Were you there at that point?
Hmm?
Were you there in France, in Normandy, on D-Day?
No, I told you I was about 10 or 12 days after.
Oh, after. I was
We were a surgical unit with nursing sisters.
Okay,
And
got you.
the reason for getting us over was it was becoming our casualties as piling up, and we were having difficulty getting them all taken back to England. And we were the first, certainly on Juno Beach, but I think perhaps in the British sector, we were the first surgical unit to land on the Normandy beach, complete with 8 nursing sisters, operating room, and even a little X-ray machine with a generator and so on. And we got out ashore, and the senior officers had gone ahead, and I found out I was the senior officer left, so I started making sure everybody's together. And the beach master, who was a major, and we were all told that he can order anybody, including the highest general. He's in charge of the beach. As long as you're standing on that beach, he's the senior officer. And he came up to me and he said, "Get this goddamn unit out of here now." I'd been fiddling around trying to find out if everybody was there, so we marched out and found our senior officers, and then we went back a mile or two and bivouacked somewhere in the field, and then we got a message once again by motorcycle telling us where to go and set up our whole unit. And that was about halfway to Caen. And we had a major amount of surgery came through our unit. And then there were a couple of other, there's one in Bayeux to our west and another one over in the British sector. But we just worked steadily to the point that the orderlies lifting these stretchers back and forth, they gave up before the nursing sisters and the doctor gave up. We had to go from a 12-hour day to an 8-hour day. So keep them. We all slept in slip stretchers.
No, you were dealing with the casualties left over from D-Day. Is that where all that awful slaughter took place? And by the time you arrived, there was a lot of injured victims?
That's right. This is the first unit we had. That's where we laid out. And there's nobody moving there because we've just been told to break camp. And I just ran over and got the picture. But it was, it had been a pretty busy place, but they wanted us to move further out, closer to the action. And I think there'd be a resuscitation tent, a medical tent, a resuscitation tent, an operating room tent, and various ancillary things.
So what type of surgery would you do? Would you have a lot of amputations?
Well, we didn't have a lot of amputations, as few as possible. We got people with their legs half shot off, so you finish the amputation, or chewed up, and the muscles all chewed up. But what you did was the new method of treating. That is, you take all the potentially dead tissue away, and you put some gauze over it. Oh no, you wash it, pour saline on it, right on this great big open wound. Just pour a whole jug of saline,
after you'd cleaned it, cut away the dead tissue, taken away all the dirt, cinders and so on, and then put some Vaseline gauze over the whole thing, and then put a plaster cast on. And that form of
Except really well.
I don't speak as well as I used to.
Yeah, no, it's fine. So how about, so it was more legs than arms that were being amputated?
Oh, everything. The fellow would, these 88mm guns were terrible things. They'd get on the barrel. They were the best gun in the whole war. They were just wicked, high velocity, and they could shoot a shell that went through everything, go through any tank. Sherman tank, any tank we had just went right through. Or it could hit the tank or whatever and burst in fragments. And usually if you're getting a bunch of troops up the road, you just fire one of those bursting shells, you see. And this, for example, this young guy just flattened himself on the road, and he got lacerations here all the way down his back, his arms, and legs and feet, and one testicle blown off and the other half, so we did a meticulous, careful reconstruction of his only testicle. But there were flesh wounds and fractures and flesh wounds. And there were some people driving along in a jeep or something hit a landmine, and these would be all things that come up, catch them under the jeep. You got everything that you could think of.
How, was that difficult to deal with? Seeing like young boys, age 19, coming in?
They were all young. All the soldiers. It just make you sick. All the soldiers were under 20 years of age. And you go and look at the graves there, and there's acres of graves, and you just walk along 17, 18, 19, 18, 20, and then now 24, and he's a major or something.
Yeah.
These are all hospital places.
But how did you deal with it? Did you just try not to personalize any of the people coming in? You just focused on...
Just focus on your job. And these guys didn't complain.
Did you give them anesthetic, or did you have enough painkillers, or did some of these people have to...
They'd have to have an anesthetic. We had an anesthetic, anesthetist there. 2 tables, and we looked after both tables. And some of them were so badly shot up we couldn't even lift them out of the broken arms, and we couldn't lift them out of the stretcher, so we just lifted the stretcher and put the stretcher on the operating table.
Yeah.
So he wouldn't be moved, he wouldn't be hurt, and then give him anesthetic. But no, it was we saw more surgery there than I guess they did in any front in Northwest Europe.
Yeah.
You can get an idea of the thing there. And we all slept in slip trenches. And
was there ongoing battle, or are these people from the D-Day battle?
Every day.
Every day.
Yeah, they were sending out patrols to find out where the enemy are, and they find themselves beyond the enemy, and the enemy all hidden in the cellars and so on. And they seemed to be much more.
Now, did they have a medical team who were actually in the trenches and fighting with the soldiers?
Well, the person in the trenches, there weren't any trenches much. You went along and dug a slip trench, just big enough, about 2 feet deep, so that if you were in it, and the shell burst, all the shrapnel would be going over you.
Yeah.
If you got a direct hit, that was it. But the first thing they did when they stopped, this is the fighting area, but the first thing, if you're stopping for the night, then everybody just digs a slip trench for themselves. and the gunners dig a hole for their gun. But that was I didn't realize how continuous it was until I read this Guns and Army. And the old British system of sending out patrols and sending out a tough bunch of soldiers to try and break the line, and 3/4 of them being shot, the rest come back.
Mm-hmm.
Some units being totally wiped out. 30 or 40 guys were put in.
Mm-hmm.
And it was, what happened was that Con, what's the good picture of Con? Con became so active, and that was part of their plan, to keep the thing active all the time. So they concentrated all the Panzers, the Tiger tanks, and Panzer tanks, and all their youth, young, whatchamacallit. There were certain battalions made of young boys who'd gone through the Nazi school from the age of about 5.
Mm-hmm.
And they were all fiendish fighters. They were all told not to come back if they didn't run. So they all just fought just fiendishly. I mean, how would they go after somebody like that? But they had a fair number of these young bloods, or whatever they call them, there, and they kept most of the German army busy, right off Con. Their guns, most of their 88 millimeters. And so what happened was that the Americans had a bit of flack here and there, but nothing like they did, because everyone in the German army thought if they lost Con, then they were going to have their whole army caught in the pocket, you see.
Yeah.
So what this book says is never emphasized, but the Germans, at least the Americans, took off under Patton and came around.
Mm-hmm.
And he was supposed to meet the guys after they'd taken Con and come up here. But that Con fighting had such a fantastic concentration, it was impossible to burst through any sooner than they did. And as a result, several of them a good many of the German army got through that Valley Gap. We followed up beyond Con. We followed the army. We were the first surgical unit beyond Con on the way to Falaise. We were put in a quarry, and there were so many casualties around there that we were given orders to only do wounds of the belly, or sucking wounds of the chest, or compound fever, whatever, everything was back. And we sent everything back to the beachhead.
And they would wait?
Put them in an ambulance and give them a bottle of blood and send them in.
But they were not given priority, so they would have to wait to get treated. And they would just sit there with, like, if their leg was blowing off, they would...
I mean, the ones we didn't have.
Yeah.
This was a unique situation. There were not many cases where the casualty clearing station was so inundated that they were only told to take certain things.
Mm-hmm.
And the others were watch the blood pressure and fix their dressing, stop any bleeding you think you can do, give them a shot of blood. Everybody got type O blood. There was no type O.
What would happen to some type blood, though?
Just stop the blood and thin them out.
No, but what happens if you...
Type O is a universal donor.
Oh, it is. Okay.
But that doesn't mean that you can't get a certain percentage of type O's get a reaction from the other types. And if they started showing a serious reaction,
Mm-hmm.
that was a smell after we in Con, and then we got north of Con. The smell was awful.
Just of dead bodies?
Dead bodies, dead cattle, dead horses. And bellies all blown up and their legs sticking up. The smell was terrible. And when we were told the officers were told to pick a spot, put your small tent up, and so on. Go about it right now. So Joe, Luke, and I, we dug a little trench and put our tent up. And all during the time we're doing this, I said, Jesus, that smell is a hell of a lot stronger than it's out around. Do you think we got something nearby? So, and we both walked along the hedge, about 20 feet from here to the stairway. This poor old German soldier tucked in. He sort of snuck into the hedge to hide. Died there.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the sort of thing. It was a wild, tough bit of fighting. The artillery say there were more shells fired into the German lines than any other battle in history. Per day.
Was there just a hatred for the Germans?
Sorry?
Like a real hatred for the Germans during that time? Like all your team of people, be it British, American, Canadians? Like a real hatred for German?
No, they brought German soldiers into our place.
Oh, they did? For you to treat?
Yeah. Remember, the first one came in was one of these young whatchamacallits, the Nazi elite, they call them.
Yeah, Hitler Youth.
Hitler Youth, yeah. And he was really badly wounded. And he just lay on that stretcher and looked at me or looked at whoever was in charge of us at the time. And not a smile and a tough look on his face. And we operated on, there weren't all that many that came in that particular section. There might have been times there would have been. And that's what, we're mostly Canadians. And the British, the Americans on one occasion bombed our lines before Cologne was taken. And we received all the casualties. It was one of these cases where they were doing night bombing, and the pathfinder would go out, and when he thought he found the German lines, he'd drop a flare, and the other would come in. Well, he dropped the goddamn flare in the middle of the Canadian line. And we had these guys, and there wasn't any of them that said that goddamn Air Force or something. I never heard anyone. They were just part of the show. They knew a couple of guys that had got it, and they were still alive. Then the British officers came along to see these guys who had been killed accidentally. The high brass, 2 or 3 of them came in, and the colonel took them around our resuscitation tent and post-op tent.
Mm-hmm.
And one of them said, well, of course, you have these Yanks. You never know where they're going to drop the goddamn bombs and so on.
Mm-hmm.
And 10 days later, the British did the same thing to one of our artillery units. And we got another influx. Not all that many. There might have been, I don't know how many casualties. I don't know how many were killed, but we got maybe 40 or 50.
Did you ever recognize anybody?
I mean, did I
Who
know anybody
came
that
in?
came in as a patient? No.
Yeah.
No. Did you ever hear of Dr. George Woodhouse? Your mother would know.
No.
He was a medical officer in one of the units that they had. One of the battalions, front line.
Mm-hmm.
And he came down just for a rest one day and have a cup of coffee or find if anybody had a bit of Calvados, which was the only liquor you could buy there. And during the conversation, he pulled out his scissors. He had a big pair of scissors hanging like a sword from his belt. And he said, in the last week I've amputated 3 legs with these scissors.
Mm-hmm.
So it was a whole different world. It was
Like, how would you get through a day? Was there a real morale between the people that you were working with and the nurses and yeah? And how did the nurses fare during that time?
Or the Americans?
No, like whoever the nurses were that you worked with. I'm assuming they were Canadian.
Oh no, they were further down the beach. We never saw an American unit.
Yeah.
It was the Canadians and the British. There was no intermixing at all.
Yeah. But the nurses did you keep in touch with everyone that you worked with during the war, after the war?
Yes, oh yeah, we had a reunion. One of the nurses lived in Oakville, and one lived in St. Catharines.
Mm-hmm.
I suppose I saw maybe half of them at different functions, and then I used to hash over old times.
Yeah.
The operating room nurse that worked with me, and I didn't have an assistant. I didn't have a male assistant. The nurse looked after the instruments and also was your assistant.
Mm-hmm.
Jean McCrae was her name. And we reminisced a bit on that.
Mm-hmm. Well, you must rely heavily on those around you, because they're the one constant that you're with throughout the day, and going through the same paces that you are. So I can see, for your whole sense of morale really depending on the people that you were with.
Sure, I'll pick up the answer to that question.
It wasn't so much a question, it's just a comment how I can understand that there's a bond between those that you worked with. Yeah.
I mean, we were all in battle dress, all sleeping in slip trenches, all eating together, line up with you.
You slept in the trenches?
In slip trenches.
So what happened when it rained?
That picture of me there, right behind me.
This one?
Yeah, right behind me is a slip trench. That goes down about 2.5 feet.
And that's where you'd sleep?
Yeah, there were 3 options up there.
And that's just if you were bombed, you're safer?
Well, yeah. And the other thing was that finally the warships got on the water outside, and they were shelling Cong. And these goddamn shells all came over our unit, right over our heads, screaming away. And you never know whether one of them might be a little short.
Yeah.
Sometimes.
Were you there for the whole duration of the war?
No, there's no. I was there for the part of the war that was the most vicious,
Mm-hmm.
and then they finally broke through at Calais, and Patton came down, and they caught this group, and they tried to get over the River Seine. Can you see the Seine River?
It's right there.
Vehicles and men and so on across here. But by that time they had no air superiority. And I have pictures in my album it was just absolutely fantastic. They had to raft across. And for about a mile, there was just a whole mass of vehicles that had been bombed from the air. And guys, some in the process of running off the road to hide and so on. And we got there before they'd all been cleaned up. The colonel said, let's have a look at this. So we took a couple of us and we drove right to the Seine River.
Mm-hmm.
This had just happened the day or two before. And what happened was that even the mosquito planes, which were made of plywood, and there were fighter planes, and one good shell or a couple would knock them out. They went fast, and they went low, so they wouldn't be seen. And they didn't carry parachutes.
Mm.
So if they were shot, they were shot. And these mosquitoes had come over, and the fastest by far of anything in the air in Europe, about 450 miles an hour, with this goddamn little bit of plywood. And they'd come zooping down, and all these guys lined up in trucks and tanks and vehicles and guns and so on. And just strafed them, Rode the next guy, rode the next guy. And the typhoons, for another British-Canadian plane that just carried one, strong enough just to carry one big, what do you call it? It's a great big bomb, cigar-shaped bomb. And they would just swoop in and drop this thing. It was a really nice.
Did you ever have to use a gun during the war?
No, we carried a 38 revolver. And they got it tied up here. See, it looks like a 6-shooter. And remember how they used to fill them full of cartridges, close them, and then fire away. And the Americans had a much fancier gun. It was automatic, semi-automatic. They all wanted our guns, and they'd trade one of their guns and all the money they could get together to get one of ours, because that reminded them of home and the cowboys and so on.
Yeah. So you never had to...
You asked me a question, and I was the most disappointed person in the world, because I had some heparin and some arterial suture, and when the thing settled down, I was hoping to get some of these limbs, but only had an artery lesion. And to cut a leg off just because the artery's gone, that's what got me interested in vascular surgery. I just thought that was the one thing in the Allied Army that they didn't do well, and that is they didn't make any attempt to sew up these arteries.
Yeah.
It was a new thing. But I had all the stuff there, but I didn't have the temerity to spend a couple of hours doing that with all these guys out in the tent.
Mm-hmm.
So I left the material in our unit, and Bill Mustard, who came along, made use of it. He had one working under terrible conditions. I couldn't tell how much heparin he was getting and so on. He had one fellow who preserved his leg out of about 50.
Yeah.
And it was led the way and showed that it could be done.
So all these...
I was Dr. Galley, who was enormously important guy. He was the fellow who appointed who was going to be the chief surgeon in Europe for the Canadian Army. He was professor, and he was dean, and he decided to bring one of us back every 6 months to be senior resident. And we brought Dr. Ted Durr, Bruce Toby, and my number came up, and it was just at the time I was overseas. They were hauled back before this all started. So I went to the consultant surgeon of the Canadian Army in McFarland, and I pled with him. I told him I had this arterial suture. He said, I've got orders. He said, you're off. So I followed the unit for a while, and it got very quiet. They went along the coast mopping up pockets of resistance. And Ted Durr, interestingly enough, came and took me.
Oh, really?
And
so do you not seen him in years, and then...
I didn't know he was coming. This guy just suddenly came in.
But you were friends from school before, were you not?
Oh, yeah, we've been rooming together.
So that must have been nice, reunion.
We saw each other for 2 or 3 days, and then I was hoisted back. And did the surgery in the hospitals in England for a while. Terrible business. Nobody really knew what was going on, and I did my 6 months, and I was still aching to get that correcting arteries that had been, because nobody had ever done it. And so when they said you're on your way back, I said fine. I didn't pay much attention to the date. And I got down to Halifax, and I was to wait there a week or two for a boat, and I suddenly realized that VE Day was coming. looked as if we were going to win the show. So I got on the phone. I phoned Dr. R.I. Harris, who was big in the Army here, and I couldn't get hold of him. And I phoned anybody who I thought had any pull in the Army to take me off this draft, because I'd get home. But I couldn't. And, it was a useless kind of work. That's the one time I was depressed for a while, going back and waiting for another transport.
To take you back again to Europe?
No, I just went to England and waited for a transport back and bugged them to let me back as soon as I could. And I was sitting around doing the damn home. I read books. I remember reading that great book, The Sun Is My Undoing. Have you ever seen that?
No. How long did you wait for?
I must have been over about 5 or 6 months.
Really?
4 or 5 months. Before I get back.
So, my mom was born at that time, was she not?
She was born when I was still waiting for the Normandy front.
Yeah.
And then I was sent back. And of course, Planned Parenthood was just a catchphrase in those days. And ended up with Ruth pregnant when I went back on this quick trip to.
Yeah.
And of all the goddamn things, she had the second baby while I was away.
Yeah.
That really depressed me. That's my low point of my Army career. But,
Was it hard for Grammy being on her own?
That was awfully hard. Her mother is a lovely, loving thing. Ruth was left alone in this little house in Warner Park alone. And I'll tell you that when I came back, Kelly said, "You've done a good job. You got yourself interested in arteries. I'll send you down to Johns Hopkins, and you can learn all about hearts and arteries, and come back here and I'll put you on the staff." And I said, "Well, I couldn't accept it." I said, "I've been in the Army for 4.5 years, and I've been away from a wife who's got 2 children without me." And I said, "She's top priority now. I'm going out to Vancouver or Brandon to set up the show." Brandon was open, and I knew a lot of people in Vancouver. I love that city.
Yeah.
So I talked to Ruth and said that was really the way I felt. And she said, "You should reconsider it. I think this is your career. You come back if you're really interested in things like that. You want to do some research on it and so on." And the other thing was that it meant that she was going to be in Toronto with her friends, you know. But the big thing was that she was very kindly disclosed to me. So since then, I've thought that over. And I thought 4.5 years in the Army, then I go away for 10 months, post-grad, and leave her with 2 children in my father's house. I will never, ever be able to repay my debt to her. And so from now on, if there's any even minor thing that's going to affect her happiness or her physical well-being, I'm behind it. And of course, this is what happened with the wedding. I mean, she just felt it would be too much, and she's great, man. You know?
Yeah, she
Terrific.
looks great.
And she was just she'd been 6 weeks just getting better every day. And I knew that anything prolonged more than 24 hours is devastating. So that's one of the reasons. I just had no trouble making up my mind into it. It was the best thing for her life.
So you saw my mom when you came back from the war, then very briefly, right? When mom, like my mom was just born, you saw her when she was an infant then. And she doesn't remember you, but the first time she remembers you, I guess, it was when you finally came back and she was about 4 years old. And she was night before Christmas, yeah. But that must have been a very interesting experience coming back and then seeing a child who was 4 years of age. Yeah.
So lots of pictures of me on cross.
Yeah.
But, well, she was such a going concern and interested in everything. And she was an absolute delight.
Yeah.
And Johnny was easygoing, and anybody took a toy away from him, he'd say, "Why did you do that?" But no, it was great. And
Yeah.
they gave me my job in the hospital.
Mm-hmm. But did you lose any friends in the war? Like when
Yes,
you came home?
a fellow I was training with, Jacques Bourgeois, one of the first French Canadians to be trained in trauma and surgery. And his father was a surgeon in Montreal or Quebec. Wonderful guy.
Mm-hmm.
And he was in a destroyer, and that there were 3 battles. If you remember, I said there was North Africa, the Italian campaign, and then Northwest Europe. And they got Rommel tied up, and they threw in the sponge, and all the towns along gave evidence that they had thrown down the arms and would be treated as such. And this guy named the Canadian destroyer went into to one of the harbors of a town that had supposedly thrown down the white flag and so on. And just when it got into the narrow part of the harbor, they just pounded with them. Well, it might have been just the local guys, I don't know. But, and then there was a high mortality rate. That was the first of my friends. I had men that I knew, guys from out west that I knew. A fellow I played hockey with, Raven. Custy Wright, another hockey player I played with, from Brandon. But I was not involved physically or geographically. This word got through that they were friends. So in that sense, it wasn't a tremendous load for me to carry.
Yeah. When you came back from the war, did you have like dreams, or was it kind of difficult to get assimilated back into functioning society?
No, I don't think so. Ruth and I joined up with other returned people. Dura was back, Bill Mustard was back, George Bodden was back, and we got together. The girls all knew each other. And it was sort of an elite club, really.
Yeah.
Returned officers.
Well, I guess the girls probably became quite close here, too.
They did.
Yeah.
Lise Mustard, they rented a cottage together one time. It was quite a war. I really... Of course, you never know when something's going to land, one of these shells or whatever. The closest I came was that we were given a new place to set up our tents, and we had the unit all set up, and somebody had scrounged some Calvados from one of the local farmers, and we medical officers sitting around in sort of folding chairs having a drink. And there were 3 or 4 of us here, I remember, and 3 or 4, I don't know why there was a distance. We were near our tents, and they were sitting in front of theirs. We were talking across, and the distance wasn't longer than this room. And we heard a plane coming, and there was a German Messerschmitt flying just over the treetops. And when it saw a unit, it just had to dip a few feet, and it strafed our unit just right, and the bullets went between the 2 of us.
Wow.
And it didn't kill anybody. And then he suddenly saw the big great big red cross, which we have on the ground.
Mm-hmm.
And he stopped shooting then. And the interesting thing about that was we watched him, and he started turning around. I guess he shot all the shells to go back to his lines. And he was still flying fairly low for why, I don't know. And when he got to our lines, which are over there, just about a block or a couple of blocks over, all of a sudden there was an aircraft.
Mm-hmm.
And his plane became three pieces. There was a motor and a body and a plane. Just like that. It's the same guy that strafed us.
Yeah.
And it all happened. It was a nice scenario. We watched the plane go in.
Mm-hmm.
This anti-aircraft crew was just ready for something like that.
Wow.
But you know, in this war, you'd be going along. The story is apparently in a safe situation, all of a sudden things would change.
Mm. Now, what about all the men that came back with missing limbs, like amputated arms and legs? Was there like a real crisis, like when they came back, about finding work and
wounded people?
Yeah.
Well, that's why they built Sunnybrook Hospital,
Mm-hmm.
to handle it. It was built to handle the best people they could get were shot up there as a part-time staff, and then they all died or got better, and then the staff, then Sunnybrook became more of a civilian hospital.
Yeah. But did they get like war amps? Did they have like fake limbs? Did a lot of them go back to work, or were there a lot of? Because I know you hear about in the Vietnam War, a lot of the men coming back, just even emotionally and mentally, they weren't able to function properly in society again because it was so damaging.
Oh. And gunners, some of the artillery and all that banging and so on.
Mm-hmm. And were they given money, I guess, from the Canadian government to live off of?
Pensions. The pensions department was one of the biggest departments in the government. They researched every individual and assessed what his disability was. Of course, he'd have to come back every year. In case he got better, they would reduce it. If he got worse, they'd increase it. They were pretty fair. Really, they were. And I think they had some men in the pension department that had been in the show themselves, and they had kindly disposed to the wounded guys. But that was a response to answer your question about the whole thing about that.
Yeah.
We first went to Christie Street, which is a little half-assed hospital on Dupont or Danforth. But they very quickly started building Sunnybrook. They wanted the best, and they wanted adequate care for them. Very supportive.
Yeah.
Very supportive. And now they have a K-wing. The K-wing is for anybody who came into that category and who's dying. And if you haven't got proper facilities, you can apply to K-wing. And they'll take you in for the last few weeks or months or days or whatever.
Well, you're a wealth of information, and we probably should get going because Grammy's waiting, but